Hi folks, and welcome back to the New Zealand Property Podcast and Video Series, sponsored proudly by Property Ventures Real Estate. Today we're reciprocating the podcast that Oliver Hartwich from New Zealand Initiative did with myself a couple of weeks ago. And we want to find out a bit about Oliver, a bit about the New Zealand Initiative and what a centralised government could or should look like in New Zealand and how it does in other places in the world. So welcome along, Oliver.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah, pleased to have you there, and I've just come to meet you. Know a bit more about you in the last month, and it's, I'm sure you're going to enlighten the listeners today.
Well, great to be on your podcast. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, good. So, okay, to start off with, before we talk about the New Zealand Initiative, can you just tell people a bit about who you are and where you've come from?
Oh, God, that's a long story.
Yeah, it's a long story.
I'm Oliver Hartwich, and I'm an economist by background. I've got a master's in economics from the University of Bochum in Germany, and then I did a PhD in law also at the University of Bochum. I spent some time in Sydney for that. It was a comparative law thesis. Following my PhD, I worked in London for 4.5 years, first in the House of Lords, where I was a research assistant for one of the Liberal Democrat peers on pension reform. Then I joined a conservative think tank called Policy Exchange, which was quite closely linked to the Conservative Party leadership at the time. So that was David Cameron. My chair for a brief time was Michael Gove. So I got involved in conservative politics in Britain. And then I left London for another job in Sydney, spent another 3.5 years there. This time at the Centre for Independent Studies, where I was a research fellow, and I was also a columnist for a business magazine called Business Spectator and wrote about the Euro crisis mainly there. And then in 2012, I was asked whether I'd like to lead a New Zealand think tank, and I had previously not spent that much time in New Zealand, about I think 5-6 days on speaking engagements. And that sounded interesting. So I took the job offer, moved to Wellington, and I've been there ever since, leading the New Zealand Initiative. And I've recently become a New Zealand citizen.
Well done. Congratulations on that. And we're pleased to have people like yourself as New Zealand citizens. I can vouch for that. You did do that very brief because you've done a lot before you got here. So that's all good. So I'll just talk briefly first about the New Zealand Initiative, and the listeners and watchers might remember this from the New Zealand Business Roundtable. They would probably know that I'm picking more than they know what the New Zealand Initiative is at the moment. I might be wrong, hopefully, with several people. So tell us what the New Zealand Initiative, I guess the purpose is, and how does it operate?
Well, we are quite an unusual organization. So we are a think tank. And I mean, there are many think tanks around the world. They're typically working on issues like housing or education or foreign direct investment or whatever else it might be. And we do that, except unlike most think tanks overseas, we are financed not on a project by project basis. We don't go out fundraising for projects. We have membership. So in that sense, we are more like a business club. And we're glad to have members like you. So members who actually believe in the mission come on board, but they don't do that for a single project, but they do it because they think there should be a think tank looking at the big issues for the country in the long run. And in that sense, we are not a business organization. I mean, there's Business New Zealand, there's the Bankers Association, there are other business clubs actually doing the conventional lobbying for day-to-day affairs of business. That's all very well served by our colleagues in other organizations, but that's not what we do. We look at the long-term future of the country. We are asking ourselves what New Zealand could be like in 20 or 30 years' time. So we're not looking at lobbying for our members' bottom line next year. We're not doing that on their behalf just for their own individual interests, but we actually take a broader look at the countries that we think are really important for New Zealand in the long run. And that includes then things like education, housing, local government, or foreign direct investment. And we think in that way, we want to make a long-term impact on the prosperity of the country with the purpose of lifting the prosperity for all New Zealanders, not just a single group and certainly not just companies. So we actually take a very broad outlook on public policy.
Yeah, and that's the thing I've really noticed is it's unlike other organisations, everything sort of seems to be doing for the right reason, as you said, for the good of the country. It's people got their personal interest taken out. It's like when you read anything in the media, there's usually a hidden agenda or an obvious agenda of why they're writing something.
And you know what? I've just noticed something really unusual. The sun has come through, and it's Wellington. So I think I better close my blinds because I constantly have it in my face. If you just
that's all good. Yep, that's good.
And I should have mentioned that we're of course based in Wellington, which you couldn't tell today because it's so sunny.
I can actually see the sun. You're proving a point. It is sunny in Wellington. Geez, this is unusual.
We can't beat it on a good day.
I can't beat it on a good day. You get a couple of good days. I'll spend a bit of time in Wellington.
We do. No, I really enjoy the quality of life that Wellington has to offer. And actually, since I've lived in other places before, Sydney, London, originally Germany, quality of life wise, this is probably the best place I've had so far.
There's a good point there to chuck in for Wellington. Yeah, so as I sort of saying, alluding what you're saying there is everything seems there's no hidden agendas with this. I've been to one meeting so far, and it's a pretty robust group who are trying to do the good for the country rather than their own personal interest, and which is sort of seems unusual. And what I like is the top tier of business people in New Zealand are doing that, which is fantastic.
Yeah, we're privileged in that regard. I mean, it's very unusual. The only other think tanks that are structured a little bit like us I've seen are in Switzerland, in Austria, and perhaps one in Denmark, but that's about it. Most other think tanks work differently. And I have this typical conversation when I meet prospective members and I try to explain why they should come on board. And then after half an hour, typically the question comes from them. So what's in it for me? And the honest answer is actually not much. You get the occasional dinner or lunch, but actually the purpose is not to improve your company's performance. We're not lobbying for you. You're doing this because you want the country to do better. And what happens then is that initially there's a degree of skepticism, and I say, well, just give us a chance, come on board, and we'll see how you like it. And then they come on board, and after I think about half a year, they don't want to leave anymore, which is great. So I think it just takes some time to actually understand how the business model works. And then you see actually that we are trying to do things that will work for the country in the long run. I think a positive side effect in all of that is actually that we are also educating some of our members. So we've got members from all sorts of different businesses, and of course they are the experts in their fields, but they might not look into, for example, the education system and how it works, or they might not really follow all the details of the COVID management. And we do that for them, and we're trying to share that. And I've heard that a lot from members over the years, that just by reading our output, our publications, our newsletters, members felt that they got better informed over time on political debates. So maybe that's one of the service that we're actually doing, but that's a byproduct.
Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits for someone like myself coming on as well, sort of educating myself a lot more. I guess for the listeners and watchers today, the great thing for them is they know a little bit about what it is. They can almost use me as a sounding board, I guess, to get through the New Zealand initiative, because it's it's not where most of our people were property people listening to this, but it's as I said, anything in the politics of the country and the world sort of thing. If what it tries to do is assist maybe, or do the good for who's in Parliament and the opposition and what have you, to try to push policies that can actually work for New Zealanders. And we haven't seen a bit of that. We haven't seen that in housing just recently, where decisions have been made without a lot of reflection or talking to others in the game, or experts, as you say. So that's a chance there for people who are listening to this, want to suggest anything anytime. I'd say I'll welcome that on board for you if you do. So that's good.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, shall we talk about housing then?
So yeah, well, housing, and in particular, was one of the first chats we had. You talked to me for about an hour, and I just sat there and listened, and it was great. And it was about the, I guess, centralised government and which we all class as councils, which it is, I guess, but not how some very successful countries have done this. And I'm sure listeners are going to be really interested to hear what you sort of talk about in the next 20 minutes or half hour. So I'll just say over to you, and I may chirp in occasionally with a couple of questions, but start from the start, and about what you've seen overseas and how it actually can work. I'm really intrigued.
Okay, well, if I remember correctly, when we first met and we talked about this, I told you about basically my journey into housing research and how that happened.
Yeah.
And that takes us right back to my time in London. So after my time in Parliament, where I worked on pensions, which I'd never worked on before, I got my first job in think tank land on housing policy, and I'd never worked there either. So for me, this was all a big, exciting journey, quite an adventure actually, working my way into this new area. And I must say that was in 2005. I had relatively recently arrived in London from Germany, and everything was new to me. And what was certainly new to me was the experience of the London housing market. So you come from Germany, and Germany is the most boring country that you can find on the planet, at least for the housing market, because nothing ever happens. So house prices in Germany are relatively stable. It's a country of tenants. The rents are relatively stable, or at least they used to be. And we never had these excessive ups and downs in the property market. And actually, house prices in Germany don't really feature much in the news anyway. So imagine the contrast coming from that kind of background into London. And we found a flat near the A40 in Hammersmith, in an old building on the 3rd floor, 50 square meters. And I think we paid about 220 quid a week. So yeah, okay. And that would have probably gotten me a very nice flat for a month in Germany, in most cities at the time. So I knew that something wasn't quite right, and the quality of the housing stock and the single glazed windows and all of this. Well, yeah, it was pretty obvious that something wasn't quite right in British property.
Yep.
And then I got onto this project on the housing market. So then I could actually figure out what it was. But my colleagues at the time, they wanted to make this a project on the Town and Country Planning Act. And that's a bit like the Resource Management Act, of course, in New Zealand. So it's a planning law for mainly councils, how to develop their council plans and how to give planning permission. And my colleague's assumption was, if only we reform the Town and Country Planning Act, release a bit more land for development, make it easier to plan, give planning permissions a bit faster, everything's going to be fine. And coming from Germany, I had some doubts, probably because well, first of all, I'm an economist, so I like the basic approach. I like the liberalization of the planning regime as a matter of principle. But at the same time, I thought, well, Germany has all of these laws too. In Germany, you've got a building act, a construction code, you've got planning laws, and yet the experience was totally different. And so I thought, well, actually, there must be something else. It cannot just be planning laws. And so what I tried to do was, I tried to figure out actually whether my initial observation was correct. And I read through German planning legislation, and I found that basically it was very comparable to what Britain was practicing with the Town and Country Planning Act. Then my colleague said, okay, maybe the two countries are just very different on the demand side, so maybe you can't just compare. So I compared, and I found data for population density, household sizes, GDP per capita growth, migration figures, and guess what? Over the 30 years prior, there was not much between Germany and Britain.
All right.
Then my colleague said, okay, but is the house price outcome really that different? And I found data for that too. And actually, yes, it was massively different. So in Britain at the time, for the 35 years prior, house prices went up almost 5% on top of inflation in Britain, whereas in Germany, they basically stayed stable. So house prices went up with a normal level of inflation. And so we had a bit of a conundrum. Two countries that had roughly comparable demand sides, roughly comparable planning laws, building laws, and completely different outcomes on the housing front. And then we try to explain what makes these countries so different. And I convinced my colleagues to give me a travel grant. So I could go back to Germany. I got, I think, £5,000 from Policy Exchange. And on the £5,000 travel grant, I managed to visit Ireland for a week in Germany, a week in Switzerland, and 2 weeks in Australia. So that was possible, staying with friends and family, and traveling economy and staying in cheap hotels otherwise.
Yep.
But it was fun. And I spent time in these other countries just trying to interview people with a stake in the property market. So real estate agents, builders, planners, mayors, councillors, academics, lawyers. I tried to just talk to really anyone who had some idea of what was going on. Because I thought, if the situation on paper is so similar with the planning laws, it must be something else. And it's probably nowhere written in the law. It's probably nowhere written anywhere. It must be something cultural. And I had the most amazing tour of the world with these 4 different countries. And I think at the end of it, I found something that nobody had really thought of much before. And that was, it had very little to do with planning laws, what was happening in property markets. It had everything to do with how councils are funded. And that sounds perhaps strange when you first hear it, But the longer I've been working in this field, and this is, as I say, is going back to 2005, the more convinced I am that that was the right conclusion we drew at the time. And basically for the past 16 years, I've been on this mission around the world, in Britain first and in Australia now here, to convince people that that is the way to crack the housing market problem. So in summary, what I found was that in Germany and Switzerland, councils received some extra tax revenue out of development, and they could keep that. And the tax revenue was then used to help them finance the infrastructure that they needed to make that new development possible. They could also then use economies of scale from the new residents and use the economies of scale actually to deliver better infrastructure to the existing residents. And on top of all of that, with the money that was still left over after that, sometimes they could even deliver tax cuts in Switzerland, for example. So when a council developed, it got new taxpayers in, the taxpayers paid for their own infrastructure. They used economies of scale to really unlock efficiencies out of the infrastructure use. And then they could deliver perhaps a new swimming pool, a new library, a better school building, or whatever else it might be to the existing population. And on top of that, also cut their taxes. And that made development a pretty good deal. That meant the existing population was in favor of development. The council was in favor of development. Infrastructure was superb. The housing market was flexible. House prices were kept stable over time. And income taxes were also relatively low because you could actually put councils in competition with each other, and extra development meant they got more money in and they could lower tax rates. So what was not to love? And that was roughly what I found there. And as I said, ever since I've been trying to convince people in English-speaking countries that that Swiss approach to local government and housing is probably superior to the heavily centralized approach we're trying to follow in English-speaking countries like New Zealand, but also Ireland, Britain, Australia. It's all the same.
That's right. The self-funding, you said, which comes, what my understanding comes from taxes, the normal taxes we pay that go to the centralised government in New Zealand at the moment. That's so that gets somehow that gets divided back to the local areas. Is that?
Yes. I mean, the systems differ between different English-speaking countries. I mean, in Britain, for example, when we worked there, the typical situation was that an English council got about 75% of its revenue as a grant from central government in London. And these grants were adjusted every few years, but for a council, there was absolutely no way and no reason to go into development, because first you have to deliver the infrastructure, you have to deal with the NIMBYs. So all of this is costly, both financially and in political terms. But then when the people move in, or the income taxes generated, or the value added tax paid in Britain, that ended up in London, in central government. And so all the downsides of development for the council to deal with, all the upsides for central government, and of course councils weren't keen on development. Same in New Zealand. So we have a system that is different from the British system of local government, but we have a property tax-based system for local government with our rate system. And so, yes, a council gains ratepayers when it comes to development, but I mean, the rates are barely sufficient to cover the cost of infrastructure. I mean, sometimes, as you know, it can cost up to $200,000, $300,000, $350,000 for a plot to be made ready for development from the council side. And if you then gain a ratepayer, even paying $4,000 or $5,000 at rates a year, it will take a long time until that money is paid back. And of course, you have to provide services in the meantime as well. So councils actually don't really gain from development. But these new residents, of course, they pay income taxes. The new residents pay GST. And of course, in the process of building the houses, of course, the government also collects income taxes and GST and corporate taxes. And so all of the upsides of development end in Wellington. All the downsides are with the local council. So we have completely separated the pros and cons of development. One tier of government gets all the cons and one tier gets all the pros. And then we're surprised that these tiers don't talk. And that's roughly the situation that we have in New Zealand. And it limits also the competition between councils, which we found such an important aspect of planning and development in other countries, such as Switzerland. Give you an example. I own a house in Wellington. And if for some odd reason, I was dissatisfied with the performance of the city council and tried to move. I mean, why would anyone be dissatisfied with Wellington City Council? But anyway, leave that here. But if I decided to sell that house and move to Porirua or to Upper Hutt or anywhere else, well, somebody else would buy my house and pay my rate. So Wellington City Council would always get the same amount of money no matter how they treat me as a resident, because in the end, they would get it from somebody else. They can always collect that rate. Now imagine we were in Switzerland and I would pay a local income tax to the council. Well, if I, with my, I think, relatively decent income, decided I had enough of Wellington City Council and moved to Porirua, well, then Porirua would get my income tax. And that might be completely different from the person actually buying my house. And so in Switzerland, what we found was that councils simply have a better reason to treat people better and treat them as customers, whereas in New Zealand, of course, there's absolutely no reason for a council to be nice to you, because in the end, they can always charge that rate, no matter whether it's from you or from somebody else.
That's where you said what I picked up for you the first time we spoke about it was the, I guess, the togetherness you get of the council and the people in that council area, people like yourself and myself, and developers wanting to work for the more money that a developer or someone puts into an area, the more that area is going to really benefit from that, and which makes that particular area under a council a better and better place. It can really benefit from it. So the more happens, I guess, the better that area becomes.
Absolutely, and that was my experience growing up in Germany. So I remembered when I worked in London, basically local newspaper reports about some kind of development, whether it's a new residential development, a commercial development, a new factory, a new office building, whatever it might be. Typically what you would see the next day in the newspaper, in the local newspaper, is a picture of the mayor cutting a ribbon and celebrating this and saying, oh, this is wonderful news for the region, and we're developing this place. And by the way, these are our new taxpayers. So development was always seen as something really positive. And then imagine my shock coming into a different environment, London, where development, when it happened, was typically something that we would like to push away, and it's going to create some problems, and there's traffic, and the council finds it's really hard, and we have to find the infrastructure. There was never a positive story about development. And when you come from this completely different mindset where local government is pushing and fighting for development and fighting for inhabitants, at first I didn't actually get it. I didn't understand why they were so anti-development. I had one meeting in the course of our research project in Britain where we talked to a county councillor from Kent who tried to explain to us off the record why he was so anti-development. And he said, I would love to build a wall around Kent to stop people from moving in, because these people are a nuisance. When they come, we have to build the roads and the sewage and all sorts of water infrastructure. And then I have to deal with the neighbors, and they don't like them. We've got the NIMBYs, they're not in my backyard. And bananas, of course, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. So it's a complete nuisance, and they cost me money, they cost me votes, and I don't want them here. And actually, with the wall around Kent, we could tell them to go to Sussex or Wessex or Essex or anywhere but Kent, because we don't want them here. And initially I thought this is madness, because I mean, you want to develop your area, you want to have new people in, and at least my experience in Germany was different, and Switzerland is entirely different, but it makes complete sense, because in Germany and Switzerland, councils could actually capture some of the development and the revenue from that. And if there's no such link between development and local finances, then you get outcomes like in Kent. Whereas in Switzerland, what I found was completely different. I remember one meeting I had with a councillor, actually a head of planning in the canton of Schwyz. He guided me around the whole canton, and he showed me where they're developing, and this village is going to get a few new homes, and here we're going to build, and this is going to expand. And at some stage I asked him, so where are the NIMBYs? Because it was beautiful countryside Switzerland, and it was where the hills are alive, even though it's Austria. Anyway, and he said, what are NIMBYs? And I tried to explain, and he didn't get it. Yep. And I said, well, what happens? You want to build 100 new homes here. What are your locals telling you then in the village? And he says, oh, actually, they're going to ask me, why not 200? So, why? He said, because people have learned to make a calculation. Whenever we get more people in, and this canton has been expanding massively in the last few years, we gain taxpayers. And whenever we gain taxpayers, we can deliver an income tax cut after a few years. And then he said he was the most popular guy in the canton because as the chief planner for the past 13 years, he had been instrumental in delivering 6 income tax cuts. And these income tax cuts only happened because the canton grew and was not a positive thing. And I thought, hallelujah, that's the difference. That's the complete opposite of the Kent story. So in Kent, they were trying to push it away. In Schwyz, they said, can you please come in and pay your taxes here, and then we can actually lower your taxes. So once you see the different mentality at work, it is hard not to like this. And I think actually if we implemented something a little bit like that in New Zealand, I think we could probably fix our housing market within a few years.
And as far as the taxes go, so different council areas within a country, in Germany and sort of Switzerland, they'll have different tax rates they pay. But there's no one for all like in New Zealand.
Yeah, not so much in Germany. In Germany, it's much more centralized. In Germany, for example, you don't get a different income tax rate. That's the same across Germany. It could be different.
Yeah.
The constitution provides for that, but it's never been tried in practice. Whereas in Switzerland, it is hyper localized. So in Switzerland, you have 2,000 councils, 26 cantons. The whole size of the country is the size of Canterbury, roughly geographically, with about 8.5 million people. And each council and each canton can charge its own income tax. It's just amazing.
Right.
It works. And what it does is actually, because the thing is so small scale, if you don't like what your council does, you can move just across the road and you get a different income tax cut, a different income tax rate. And in that sense, Switzerland provides a model of competitive localism and federalism with checks and balances on councils and with a lot of local participation in democracy and with a relatively stable property market. I mean, don't get me wrong, Swiss house prices are quite high, but the important thing is they've been stable over decades. It's only recently with the negative interest rate environment that house prices have gone up a bit in Switzerland, creating a sort of a property boom. But really for decades, if you really take long-term data going back to 1970, you can see how stable compared to the English-speaking world, Germany and Switzerland have been.
I guess the people running these local governments are a wee bit different than the sort of people we get running the councils in New Zealand. We get some people with really no business knowledge at all, not knowledge at all. They're passionate people, many of these councils in New Zealand, but they don't have the education behind them to do that.
That's true. And part, it's a chicken and egg problem. If you give councillors greater scope and greater freedom and greater funding tools, you probably attract different people into local government too. So in Switzerland, it's quite an ambitious thing to be a councillor, to run for your local council, because you can actually do things. Whereas in New Zealand, of course, we've got everything centralized. So it limits the ambitions of councillors, and it probably also limits the appeal of actually running for council. The other thing I'd say is, once you have incentives in place, it changes the way that councils behave. So even if you don't have a business background, if you know that your next council budget depends on your ability to get more people and more businesses into your area, you will behave very differently. And we can see the results in Switzerland quite clearly.
Well, there's a few developers sitting listening to this will be going that, this is a bit different than in New Zealand, where we go to the council and it's almost a battle for them and us sort of thing, rather than them welcoming you on board to help the area, because that's what you're trying to do, and do infrastructure and make it all work. And
no, it needn't be that way. Actually, I can tell you a couple of examples from our trip to Switzerland we did in 2017. We took a membership to Switzerland on a week-long tour. So we had about 36 CEOs and chairs of large New Zealand companies with us for a week of exploration in Switzerland, trying to figure out how the country is run. And 2 incidents in particular are still with me quite vividly. One was a visit to Stadler Rail. So Stadler Rail is perhaps the world's leading boutique railway manufacturer. They're located in a little village called Busnang. That's in the canton of Thurgau. So it's very rural, scenic, agricultural. But in the middle of all of that, in the middle of the fields, you have this railway factory. And that main factory employs, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 people. So it's quite a big factory. A beautiful factory, by the way. You could eat from the floor. It's clinically clean, and it was very impressive. Anyway, background story to that factory. it was a guy called Peter Spuler who bought a little railway workshop employing just over a dozen people in 1989. And he bought it on a bank loan of $6 million from his wife's grandmother, I believe. And so he built this up from a really small workshop to a company now employing, I think, 7,000 people worldwide and present on 5 continents, with the main factory still where the original workshop was in Busnam, but now as a big factory. So he built it up to a massive operation. He himself has actually gone up in value quite a bit. He's worth $2.6 billion now. Oh, and in the meantime, he also spent 13 years in the Swiss federal parliament. So he's a larger than life entrepreneurial figure. So anyway, we visited the factory. We were totally blown away. And then our members wanted to know, how was it possible to build something in this pristine rural environment? Was it difficult dealing with the council? And Peter Spuler looked at us, laughed, and he said, I'm the biggest taxpayer in the canton. Go figure.
Exactly.
They didn't make it difficult for him because they saw him as someone generating taxes. And therefore the factory was able to expand. Another example, we were on Lake Lucerne in a beautiful alpine panorama. And we were together with the head of Switzerland Tourism, the deputy CEO actually. And he pointed out a few cranes on one of the mountains. And he said, do you see the cranes? And we said, yep, sure. He says, we're building a new hotel resort there. So 2 5-star hotels and 1 4-star hotel, altogether 400 beds, 800 and something jobs, and $880 million project volume. Ooh, our members from a tourism background were really interested.
Yeah.
How is this happening? Who's building it? Oh, he said, it's the Qatar Investment Fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Okay, our members asked, so how did you get that past the Overseas Investment Office? Oh, we don't have that in Switzerland. Okay, fine. How did it work with the council and the canton? Oh, he said, quite easily. The Qatari investors came in and they said, we would like to build here. How can we make that work? And the council immediately tasked an economic consultancy, and they calculated that if they said yes to development, that would mean about an extra $1,000 of tax revenue per man, woman, and child in this canton in perpetuity every year. And then they thought it was a good idea. So they gave planning permission. The investor asked, are there any environmental concerns? Happy to meet them, met them, and within a couple of years, the whole project took off. And then the deputy CEO of Switzerland Tourism turned around to our members, especially from tourism, and said, okay, but how would that have worked in New Zealand? We said, okay, first of all, the Qatari investors would have come in, and they would have recognized that actually it's quite hard to get Overseas Investment Office approval. Then they would have encountered the IMA. Then they would have dealt with the council. And by the time they had done all of that, they would have probably taken the money and gone to Switzerland. So that's the difference. But if a council benefits from development, that's how they behave.
Yeah, no, I love it, love it. Hey, just a question some people might be listening or thinking is, in Germany and Switzerland, do they still have rates? Do ratepayers pay rates, or their taxes, or is it just all the taxes?
It's a bit different from our rate system. So Germany and Switzerland have different tax systems. So in Germany, it's complicated. It's Germany after all. So in Germany, you pay an income tax, like in New Zealand. The tax rate is set at the federal level, so by people in Berlin. It is collected by state governments, and then it gets redistributed to local governments. So local governments get a government grant from state governments based on a very complicated formula. As I said, it's Germany. So in that formula, you have local tax revenues, you have population figures, special needs of the area, and then the council gets some of the money generated in its area. And crucially, there is a link between economic development and what a council gets. The precise workings are really complicated, but the link is quite clearly there. In Switzerland, the link is even more direct. In Switzerland, you have a council setting an income tax. You have a canton setting an income tax as well. And by the way, the Swiss Federation also has an income tax, so it's a third tier. But the top tier in Switzerland, the federal tier, only gets about 20% of all income tax generated. The rest stays local and regional. And Swiss councils and cantons, as I said, are quite small. So you've got 2,000 councils and 26 cantons. population of 8.5 million altogether. And so there's a clear link, a very clear direct link between what happens at the local level in Switzerland and how much a council gets. Whereas in New Zealand, of course, you get the rates revenue, but whether the council area is successful in generating economic activity, generating income tax, corporate taxes, GST, that is not reflected in the council's budget in New Zealand.
Absolutely. So, people who are going, Jesus, sounds pretty good, or it would be the way to go for many reasons. I'm guessing many developers would love the chance to be working with the council, embracing them, not fighting them. How hard would it be converted to a place like New Zealand, and what was the chances of that ever happening? I know you've talked to a relatively recent Prime Minister of the country, and who I think he said after he was not in government that he might be, they thought it might be a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, as those Chatham House rules, we'll see how much I can go. No, seriously. In some ways, the proposals are, of course, impossible to implement. It is, I think, impossible to assume that we could turn New Zealand into Switzerland, as nice as it would be. So we are not going to introduce 26 cantons for the country, and we are not going to split all our existing councils and create a few hundred new extra councils. I think New Zealanders wouldn't want that. It's unlikely to happen. As sad as it may be, because I think the Swiss model actually really works well, but it's a historic model and we can't just supplant one model and introduce it into this country here. However, what we could do, and I think there the chances are much greater, we could learn the lessons from the Swiss model and just apply them to New Zealand circumstances. So the most important thing from my perspective is to establish a clear link between local development and local tax revenue. And that one you could actually do quite easily. So what National, for example, has proposed is to have a link between new development and council's finances by paying councils an extra $50,000 for each new home consented above a historical average. So basically out of the GST revenue generated out of building a new home, central government would earmark 50,000 and say, okay, and this is what the council gets, and this is a contribution towards the infrastructure.
Right.
Whether $50,000 is enough, I'm not entirely sure. I actually think it's probably higher, and we need just even stronger incentive, but this is a good first start. ACT has also proposed something very similar. So they are now on board with an incentivization agenda. They want to take, I believe it's now half the GST generated out of new development and earmark that and say this goes to councils. And actually, even talking to people from within Labour, I think they are getting towards that point that rather than instructing councils, these are the houses you have to build and these are the numbers we expect you to do, it works a lot better if you give councils an incentive and then they will basically do it on their own. And so I think after 9 years of working on this idea in New Zealand and getting the incentives idea out there, more and more people are coming around to that incentives approach, which is encouraging, but it will probably take another few years until we see it implemented. Then again, we're working against 150 years of New Zealand history. It's been like this for a long time. It's always been going in the direction of further centralization. So what we are proposing is a radical departure from that. And when we first started talking about this in 2012, people thought we were kind of crazy. More recently, I haven't heard that. Nobody calls us crazy anymore, quite the opposite. I think the incentives approach for local government has become pretty mainstream, and we have shifted that debate towards, I think, a recognition that we need to have incentives for councils in order to unlock development, not just for development in residential property, but also for business development, give incentives for councils to become more business friendly and actually introduce a degree of competition into local government that we're sadly missing at the moment.
Okay, so the onuses will go back to the local governments, they'll be financed for it, but to actually try to solve a few of the issues we've got around the problem, rather than the government taking it all on themselves and giving demands and directions instead.
Yes, that's the idea.
Which goes back then, I guess, to the local governments working closer with the developers and what have you to make that work.
Yep, that's the idea, and I'm quite optimistic that that's achievable.
Yeah, okay, that's all pretty good. any miracle ideas you think you've got of solving all the problems of the housing problems at the moment? I guess that's the way that you see fit or forward for solving, I guess, getting more housing in areas. And I guess every area is so different too. For you're in New Zealand is so different. I mean, Auckland's completely different than a small town or even Wellington. The different demographics, I guess, how they work.
What I would say is actually, when it comes to housing policies, the only question you need to ask yourself is actually, will this proposed policy build new homes, or will it make it easier to finance the infrastructure for new homes? If the answer is yes, go for it. If the answer is it doesn't, then it's not a housing policy. And we've seen a lot of that recently. So I think the idea of removal of tax deductibility, for example, for investment properties, that doesn't build any homes. So therefore, it's not a housing policy, it's a tax policy. And I think that, take the bright line test. I mean, capital gains tax, basically, by another name. Does that build any homes? Of course not. It's another tax policy, but it doesn't build homes. So I think when it comes to the housing market, if you want to fix it, introduce policies that are conducive to increasing the supply of housing. So if you have incentives for local government and make it easier for them to finance the infrastructure, well, of course that builds homes because it changes the dynamics. But if it doesn't, if it's just a tax grab, if it's just another tax policy, just stay away from it. Or, I mean, you might want to introduce it for different reasons, but don't pretend this can solve the housing market. It can't. The other thing I'd say is, people say it will take a long time until we turn this housing market around. I'm not so sure. I think what is actually required is a clear expectation that things are going to change. Once people change their expectation of future house price inflation, they will change their behavior. And therefore, I think with a clear commitment towards unlocking the housing market and changing the dynamics, you can actually have a significant change in the market without actually the building even starting. People just have to really understand and believe that things are going to change in the future to start changing the behavior today. And I think that is key to changing the housing market. We need a credible commitment from government to change the dynamics, to introduce the incentives, and then I think we'll get different outcomes too.
That's right, and the behaviour starts now. It has to start now before it'll happen in the future. Just like, I guess, with the councils and going back now about Auckland sort of 30 years ago, I don't think anyone ever looked ahead. Going to the top a wee bit now, but going ahead and just looking at the problems we've got 30 years later, where we lack a lot of they're talking of the rail train to the airport and what have you now, and all those sort of bits and pieces, and the motorway. They're just fixing the North-Western motorway, which took so long. I mean, but it's probably where now where it should have been 30 years ago. I remember my wife used to drive in from out west and used to be on 2 lanes, crawling in like people are crawling in now. There doesn't seem to be that working togetherness, working ahead, forethought of how to change these things now. And over the bridge is only one way to get over the bridge, and there's a lot of ways. I guess it's you got to start somewhere when moving forward, and whether that's with the policies within the councils or the housing policies or whatever it is, you've got to start. Start now with the future in mind and have that common purpose.
And I think that's exactly right. We need to speed it up. The way to speed it up is to have the right incentives. Once the incentives are aligned, once councils actually want the development because they benefit from it too, it will happen. I mean, the beauty of the countries that are highlighted, Switzerland and Germany, is just that people and developers, first-time buyers, councillors, planners, builders, they're all aligned. Because if you take the constant house price inflation out of the equation, a builder wants to build a home. It doesn't make any money on land banking anymore. The first-time buyer wants to buy a house that he can afford. So aligned. And the councillor and the mayor, well, they want to generate some development because they want the tax revenue. So once you've got them all on the same platform and they have the same incentives and they want the same, you can speed things up. And that's the experience of these countries I mentioned. You have to get them on the same platform, wanting to do the same things and align their incentives, and then you will crack that housing market.
Right. I guess there's a few people listening that will potentially have ideas and what have you, and you've probably heard half of them before, and you probably get a lot of ideas brought your way. But I guess there's a chance if people do think they have a really a good idea that could make a difference for the country or government or council or whatever, here's a chance. Maybe not won't send them all straight to you, Oliver. Maybe come through me first, and I'm very fortunate to be a part of this group now called New Zealand Initiative, and as you've seen from Oliver, that Oliver's one of the many people who are passionate about this that are much wiser than myself. And can make a difference. So if you want to make, you always said you want to make a difference. Well, here's a chance to go ahead and do it. So come and see me and have a chat. Hey, fantastic having you on, Oliver. You always have much wisdom and plenty of great things to share. Anything else you want to say before we finish it off? Or?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to present the ideas to you and to your listeners. If you want to find out more about the initiative, just click on our website. It's nzinitiative.org.nz. Once you're there, sign up for our newsletter. We've got a newsletter that goes out every Friday. It's called Insights, and it will deliver provocative ideas to your inbox once a week. And if you're then still interested in becoming a member too, let us know. We need more people on board, people like Mark, supporting our work and creating a better future for this country.
Yeah, I'll put that newsletter link on the when this podcast is presented, so I'll do that. So again, thank you very much for your time, Oliver. I know you're a busy man. Have a great day in sunny Wellington, and we'll see you next time you're in Auckland.
Well, just as we were starting to talk, it started to turn again. It's raining.
You're not a true Wellington person. You wouldn't have said that.
Well, I can pretend, but you have to be honest too.
Okay, thanks very much, and we'll be back in 2 weeks, listeners, with another podcast with someone hopefully as good as Oliver. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.